We have some crazy games today at the candidates. First, Hikaru Nakamura versus Pragnananda. Hikaru with the black pieces, and we get pawn to d4 by Prag. Hikaru goes pawn to d5, knight to f3, and knight to c6. Pawn to c4 and pawn to c5, and now we have a pawn cube in the middle of the board. Now Pragnananda takes the pawn on d5, Hikaru takes on d4, queen takes d4, and now Hikaru goes queen takes d5, trying to go for an endgame. But Prag says, you know what? If you want to take my queen, you go ahead and go for it. Hikaru is down. He goes queen takes d4, knight takes d4, and now a very possible idea for Prag would be to go knight to b5, trying to go knight to c7 with a fork to the king and the rook on a8. So, of course, the best way to avoid that is going pawn to a6 by Hikaru. Now we get pawn to g3, and Prag wants to go bishop to g2, putting a lot of pressure on the pawn on b7. And now Hikaru would love to go knight to c6, but of course you can simply take on c6, damaging the pawn structure. So first Hikaru goes pawn to e5, attacking the knight on d4, which goes to b3. Knight to c6 now, bishop to g2, and pawn to a5, trying to gain some space on the queen side and attack the knight on b3. Now we get knight to b5, again with the idea of going knight to c7, forking the king and the rook on a8. And how would you stop that? How do you stop that idea? If you say that with the bishop, well, that works, but not really, because that is a free bishop. So Hikaru goes bishop to b4 check. Pragnananda simply blocks with his bishop, and now we get king to e7, very cold-blooded move by Hikaru. He can't castle anymore, but he will simply bring the rook onto d8. Now we get pawn to a3, asking the bishop on b4, what do you want to do, my friend? And Hikaru simply takes the bishop on d2 with a check. Now Prag takes back with the knight, and we get pawn to a4 by Hikaru Nakamura, preventing this knight from going back and also fixing the pawns on the queen side. Now we get knight to c4 by Pragnananda, putting pressure on the pawn on e5, and now a very possible idea would be to take the knight on c6 with the bishop to remove the defender of this pawn on e5, so that that pawn becomes a lot weaker. So now Hikaru Nakamura goes bishop to e6, attacking the knight on c4. And now if you take the knight on c6, we can simply take the knight on c4. And if you take on b7 trying to go for my rook, there's simply rook to b8. And now the bishop is under attack, the knight is under attack, and this is simply losing for Pragnananda. So instead, Prag goes rook to c1, defending the knight on c4. Now Hikaru goes rook to a6, defending the knight on c6, and we get castles by Pragnananda. Rook to d8, putting the rook on the open file, knight to e3, and now the knight is not defending a5 anymore. So Hikaru goes rook to a5, attacking the knight on b5. Instead of moving the knight on b5 away, Pragnananda takes the knight on c6. We get pawn takes c6. Well, if you take the pawn with the rook, that would be simply a free knight, so you have to move the knight away first. Then we get bishop to b3, preventing any rooks from joining the party on d1. Now we get knight to b1 by Pragnananda, opening up the file for the rook, which is now attacking the pawn on c6. So Hikaru goes rook to a6, defending the pawn, and then we get pawn to f4 by Pragnananda, trying to open up the f file for the rook on f1. But Hikaru can simply deny that idea by going pawn to e4. Now we get king to f2 by Pragnananda and rook to b6, putting pressure via an x-ray to that pawn on b2. Now we get knight to c3 by Pragnananda and pawn to g6, preventing any knight jumps on f5, which would come with a check. Rook to b1, and you would simply love to attack this rook with the bishop via bishop a2 or bishop c2. But those two squares are defended by the knights. Bishop a2 is defended by this knight, and then bishop c2 is defended by this one. So first, Hikaru Nakamura goes knight to d5, trying to distract one of those two knights. Rook to c1 by Pragnananda, and now Hikaru solidifies the pawn structure on the king side, and he goes pawn to f5. We get pawn to g4, pawn takes g4, knight takes, and knight takes on f4. King to e3, and that is an inaccuracy because of knight to d5 check. King takes e4, knight takes e3, and pawn takes. And now these two pawns are not defending each other anymore, and they have been split, which is a weakness for the long term. Pawn to c5 and rook to f4, which is taking away the f4 square for the king. So now Hikaru can go bishop to d5 check, king to e3, and pawn to h5, trying to trap the knight on g4. Now Prag doesn't move the knight away. Instead, he counterattacks the bishop on d5, which goes all the way back to a8. Knight to h6, trying to escape via f7, which is of course supported by the rook on f4, but now Hikaru goes rook to e6 check, forcing the king to go to the f-file. Rook to f6, preventing the knight from escaping via f7. Now we get king to g3, rook to h8, attacking the knight. We have rook takes f6, king takes back, and rook to f1 check. Now where do you put the king? If you go king to g5, that would be completely losing because of knight to f7 with a fork. So instead Hikaru goes king to g7, and if you think that you can escape with the knight, think again, because there's rook to f8, and now the knight is attacked by the rook and by the king, and if you move the knight, the rook on f1 is gonna fall, and this is just game over. So Prag decides to go knight to f5, trying to damage the pawn structure and winning a pawn in the process. And now Hikaru, instead of defending the h5 pawn, he decides to go rook to c8, defending the pawn on c5. Rook takes h5, bishop to b7, and king to f4. Now we get bishop to a6, attacking the pawn on c4, king to e5 by Pragnananda, and now Hikaru goes king to g6, attacking the rook on h5, which goes back to h4, and now Hikaru goes king to g5, still attacking the rook, which now moves back to h3, and now Hikaru finally takes the pawn on c4. Now we get rook to g3 check, the king goes back to h6, and pawn to e4 by Pragnananda. Now Hikaru goes rook to c6, king to f5, and bishop to f7, clearing up the way for the pawn to start running. King to e5, pawn to c4, and king to d4, preventing that pawn from going any further. Now we get rook to d6 check, king to c5, and rook to d3, offering a rook trade, but of course if you go for that, that would be a horrible idea, because now the king cannot catch a pawn and it is going to promote. So instead, Pragnananda goes king to b4, attacking the pawn on a4, Hikaru goes rook to b3 check, and Prag takes the pawn on a5. Now Hikaru takes the rook on g3, and in this position Pragnananda resigned the game. There's simply nothing to do here, because if you take the rook on g3, there's simply pawn to c3, and the king cannot get any closer to that pawn because of the bishop on f7. And now Hikaru is tied for the first place in the tournament with 6.5 points. In the game of Alireza Firouzja with the white pieces versus Nijat Abbasov with the black pieces, we have a very quick win by Alireza Firouzja. Pawn to d4, pawn takes d4, and knight takes d4. Bishop to g7 and bishop to e2, and both players are now prepared to castle. Now we get knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and pawn to d5 by Abbasov. Knight to d2, preparing a pawn push on c4, queen to d6, and pawn to c4 by Alireza Firouzja. And now Abbasov brings the rook to d8. Pawn takes d5, queen takes d5, and bishop to f3, attacking the queen on d5, which goes to f5 now. Rook to c1 and knight to e8, asking this bishop if you are interested in trading for now, but Alireza Firouzja goes rook to c5, attacking the queen on f5. And now Abbasov makes the first blunder of the game, pawn to e5. It does block the attack of this rook, but now this pawn can become a very easy target. And now Firouzja goes knight to c4, and now that pawn is attacked 3 different times and only defended twice. And now Abbasov goes pawn to f6, and what Ben Pangle always says, never push the f-pawn. And now we get rook to d5 by Alireza Firouzja, rook takes d5, and bishop takes with a check. King to h8, now bishop to c5, getting the bishop out of danger, queen to d7, and the bishop goes back to f3. Now rook to b8, just dropping the a7 pawn, now the rook goes back to a8, and knight to b6, forking the queen and the rook on a8. Queen takes d1, rook takes d1, and now Abbasov takes the bishop on a7. And he was counting on knight takes bishop on c8, but the problem is that he missed the absolute beautiful rook to d8, and in this position, Abbasov just resigned the game, because there's simply no way to defend this knight on e8. And if this knight falls, look at this king. The king is behind the bishop and the pawn, so you would have to block with the bishop, also giving away the bishop, so you will be down 2 minor pieces, and this is simply game over. If you like the video, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notifications, and I will see you tomorrow in the next round.